Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are talking about the movie Hemingway and Gellhorn. It came out in 2012 and it was directed by Philip Kaufman and written by Jerry Stahl and Barbara Turner. It is based on the true story of the stormy romantic relationship of war correspondent Martha Gellhorn and author Ernest Hemingway throughout the Spanish Civil War and World War II, but mostly the Spanish Civil War, I want to say. You can watch it on Crave if you are in Canada, or on HBO Max or Amazon Prime if you're in the Netherlands. What did you think of this movie, Sam?
I thought it was long. Yeah, I thought there were some positive aspects. I thought Nicole Kidman did a great job as Martha Gellhorn, particularly the older version of Martha. There was just such this like groundedness to her, this like I don't know. She was just the whole vibe. I thought she did a good job. And yeah, there are parts of this movie where they lifted dialogue straight from history. They tried to do this thing while they were filming it where they filmed parts of the movie in sepia so that they could try and weave in real clips from history. And they also placed the actors up against the backdrop of these clips with mixed results, I think. Sometimes it looks better than others. But, I thought the attempt was interesting to watch anyways. But I did find it dragged a little for me. What about you?
Same. I didn't really enjoy it very much, but it's not to say I think it's a bad movie. I just don't like any of the characters. At least not any of our two main characters. Like, Ernest Hemingway's a dick. And Martha is also quite, I'm going to say, abrasive. She's just the kind of person that in real life I would not get on with. I would be slightly intimidated probably, but I also would just find her really annoying. So it's not to do so much with the acting. The acting is quite good, but it's mostly, I think, Hemingway that's just annoying, and it makes her annoying. The entire vibe is just annoying. But I did like learning a little bit more about the Spanish Civil War, and I didn't know it was going to be such a big part of the movie, if I'm going to be totally honest. But there's quite a lot of sex in this movie, in a way that I don't think it needs. It's on the verge of being slightly rapey, which I don't enjoy. So, I don't know. It was trying to do a couple of things at the same time as well, especially toward the end, where it got really dark really fast, and I don't know if I like it. So, not my favorite movie, but still interesting to watch.
I think the end just felt a little rushed, particularly because they did spend so much time on the Spanish Civil War. The ending felt kind of, they were like, oh, also all this stuff happened during World War II. The end.
Yeah, it was like 5 minutes or something. It felt really short.
Yeah, so we did read some books to get a little more information. The biography that we had a look at was Martha Gellhorn, A 20th-Century Life by Caroline Moorehead. And I was interested to find out that Caroline Moorehead actually knew Martha. Her mother, Lucy Moorehead, was one of Martha's close friends. And it's a pretty well-researched, interesting biography. I agree with you that I don't think Martha is perhaps my type of person. So I think as a human being, I don't find her particularly likable, but she did lead quite an extraordinary life, I suppose. And I also read Point of No Return, which is a novel written by Martha Gellhorn. It is her war novel, I suppose. It's set during World War II, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. Obviously, what she lived through informed what she wrote about in the book. And in order to compare Martha's novel writing skills, I was a little curious. I had read Hemingway before. I read The Sun Also Rises a little while ago, but I wanted to read one of his war novels. So I read the one set during the Spanish Civil War that he actually wrote while he was with Martha, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So I read those two so I could just have some idea, because the two of them were quite competitive in their writing relationship. And I would say in summary that Hemingway is the better novel writer, but Martha was the better journalist.
I also read something. I didn't read the entire book, but I read part of her travel biography. It's called Travels with Myself and Another. And it's basically her telling you about her life through the 5 most, what she calls, disastrous journeys that she's made. And one of which, the one that I read is also in the movie. It's when they go to China. It's an interesting book. It gives you a little bit of insight into her character, but also into her relationship with Hemingway, who she refuses to name in her book. She named him Unwilling Companion is his name in the book, but you know it's him. And I will say that the relationship they show in the movie seems quite realistic in the sense that also in this book he's constantly like picking on her, both to encourage her as well as to be kind of just annoying. So I feel like they did that in the movie as well. So
Yeah, for sure. Neither of them seemed really cut out for domestic life. And when they were traipsing around Spain covering a war, they seemed to get along. And then the second they had to go actually live in a house and have a day-to-day life, they were fighting like cats and dogs. But we'll definitely talk about that more because there's quite a lot of that in the movie.
I want to say all the movie is about them agreeing and disagreeing and agreeing again. And by agreeing, I mean having sex. Anyway, let's get into the plot.
We open on an older Martha Gellhorn. This is decades after her period of time as a war correspondent during World War II. She's played by Nicole Kidman. She's, of course, as we said, a war correspondent and a novelist, and she's being interviewed, so she's having a chance to discuss her past relationships a little bit. One thing that she touches on, and that I think the biography gives a pretty good account of, is that I get the sense that Martha Gellhorn was maybe on the asexuality spectrum. She never really wanted sex. When she was attracted to people, it seemed more of kind of like a meeting of the minds type of thing. And so even, in this movie where you see her having this very passionate affair with Hemingway, I always got the sense that for her, the sex was kind of a chore. So they touch on that a little bit in this sort of initial interview moment that we get.
I feel like, I think you're right in the sense that even in a movie, it always starts with her kind of disagreeing or not wanting to, and then she gives in the movie, and that's what makes it sort of rapey for me, in the sense that makes me uncomfortable. But I guess they were both, if anything, they were both passionate people in terms of characters and personalities, and they were also very often, at least Hemingway very often was drunk, so that's always a factor. And they were in very tumultuous situations as well, so all things put together, it's kind of a whirlwind.
Yeah, she seemed to see it as paying the toll for getting to hang out with these interesting, famous men. Hemingway's not the only man that she sort of seemed to perceive sex with in that way.
I don't know, you can't see my face, guys, but I just pulled a face. I don't like that very much. But then, if she made that choice, she made that choice. It's not up to me. So in the movie, Ernest Hemingway is played by Clive Owen. We meet him. He's a famous American novelist, as you know, and a war correspondent. And we meet him as he's taking down a huge marlin. And that will be a focal point for the next scene, which is a Florida bar scene, where he and Gellhorn meet for the first time and have a little sing-song together.
Yeah, this seems to be more or less how they met. She was traveling around with her brother and her mom, and obviously she had written a few things, but she was by no means famous, and he was, of course, Ernest Hemingway. I mean, at this time, when they met, I think in the late 1930s, mid 1930s maybe, like he had already published The Sun Also Rises. What's his World War I book? A Farewell to Arms. He's quite famous already. She obviously recognizes him and, is kind of drawn to him because he's very, he's very lively in this. He's acting out. He's got all his friends around him. He's kind of the life of the party.
They all call him Papa for some reason, which I found really annoying. Like, he has a name. Come on.
I guess if your name was Ernest, you might prefer to go by a nickname as well.
What's wrong with Ernie? Nothing's wrong with Ernie in the 40s.
I don't think anyone called him Ernie. I do think Martha sometimes called him Hem.
Right. Yes, I think she does in the movie. But if I'm gonna compare this to, say, the Lee movie, for example, if you look at Martha and the way she's perceived in the movie by men, they did a great job at making her look really good. Like, she's really fashionable and really, tall and gorgeous. And I haven't seen that many pictures of her, but I think she was quite a looker. And they made her look like that in the movie. And all the men are kind of ogling her and being very annoying about it.
Yeah, later on in life, when she was aging, one of the things that she really regretted most about aging was the fact that she always used to be able to use her looks to get into places where a male journalist might have a hard time talking his way in, etc.
So similarly to Lee, I guess, who also, I think, said that was an advantage she had. That's cool.
Yeah, so Gellhorn attends a dinner at Hemingway's house, wherein I don't believe she was expecting to encounter Hemingway's wife, Pauline, played by Molly Parker, and some of his friends are there as well. So two of them, John Dos Passos, played by David Strathern, he's a famous writer, and Joris Evans, played by Lars Ulrich, are showing a film about the rise of fascism, particularly in Spain. And there's another friend named Paco Zara, played by Rodrigo Santoro, and he urges Martha, as a journalist, to come to Spain to cover everything that's happening over there as the Civil War sort of gets underway.
I do like the scene. I like the fact that they kind of show you that these people very much had this little it scene. They were very like-minded people and they liked to party, but they were also quite serious about their cause. And I didn't realize that Lars Ulrich is of the band Metallica. I did not clock that in the movie, so that kind of surprised me.
Yeah,
And
pretty cool to see him in something.
yeah, and he plays, obviously, Joris Evans is a Dutch guy. He was born Georg Harry Anton Joris Evans in 1898, so quite a bit before we meet him. And I looked him up because I didn't know who he was, even though he was Dutch. Like, I'm supposed to know all the Dutch people, right? But I didn't know who he was. But apparently this guy is quite a famous documentary maker. And other interesting things he did was he served as a field artillery lieutenant in World War I. And other things he directed, apart from what he's about to direct in our movie that we'll get to later. In 1943, he directed 2 Allied propaganda films for the National Film Board of Canada, which I thought was relevant to this podcast particularly, including one called Action Stations, which is about the Royal Canadian Navy's escorting of convoys in the Battle of the Atlantic. Interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I've not seen anything by him. I'm kind of tickled now. I might want to check something out. In Spain, Marta uses her gift of speaking to the everyman to get to know some soldiers on the international brigades. We watch her as she travels over and talks to these 2 guys that are kind of cute. And Hemingway comes overseas not very long after her. We meet Stalin's engineers in Spain, which is Mikhail Koltsov, played by Tony Shalhoub. And we also meet combat photographer Robert Capa, played by Santiago Cabrera.
Yeah, Kappa's kind of an interesting figure. He was the only civilian photographer to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He later supported Martha's divorce from Hemingway. And actually, Hemingway's marriage to his 4th wife, Mary Welsh, is what effectively ended their friendship because Kappa told him that he wasn't behaving well, and Hemingway threw a bottle of champagne at his head. Yeah, and then unfortunately, Kappa was killed about 10 years after the end of World War II when he stepped on a landmine covering what was happening in Vietnam.
Always the war correspondent, I guess, or combat photographer in this case. Kind of sad that he had to step on a landmine.
Yeah, we're getting to see this Russian influence in Spain. At the time, basically what had happened was there was an elected Republican government, and then the fascist forces under Francisco Franco were trying to effectively overthrow the government. So the groups that were supporting the duly elected government were supported secretly, not so secretly, by the Soviets, because of course the communists were some of the earliest fighters against fascism. And so that had a lot of impact on Americans who would go overseas to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the elected government, were often, they would come back and they would find themselves victims of McCarthyism in the States because people would say, oh, well, you were fighting for the communists. You were an anti-fascist too early. Back then, only communists were anti-fascist. So I thought it was interesting in this movie that we do get to see some Russian figures and some Russian influence at play.
I think it's quite complicated if you don't know a lot about the Spanish Civil War to catch on to the political tendencies of the time. They try to explain it to you, but they don't dumb it down. So it's good to read up on it a little bit if you're watching the movie. I also did not, by the way, recognize Santiago Cabrera at all. I was like, I know this guy, but I don't know who he is. And then you told me who it was. I was like, wait, what?
I know, it's been so long since BBC Musketeers.
I love that show. I don't know if I ever finished it, but I did like him in that. I feel like he's one of the more likable characters in this movie.
Yeah, although we don't see too much of him, I don't think.
No, not after Spain, I guess.
Yeah, so a bombing shakes the hotel. I mean, they're really kind of in the thick of it. There's fighting happening in the streets, not that far away from them. And Hemingway locks Gellhorn in her room, ostensibly for her safety, but you also get the sense kind of to be a shithead. It's the continuation of this really odd flirtation that continues as they tour the front lines and back roads of Civil War era Spain. There's a scene where they're in sort of the lobby of the hotel and there's all these journalists around and, foreign people who have come to Spain to sort of be involved in what's happening. And Hemingway challenges a Russian general who's played by an uncredited Robert Duvall, by the way. I went and looked it up and I was like, that was Robert Duvall. Anyway, so Hemingway challenges this guy who's flirting with Martha to a game of Russian roulette, which is based on real events.
She hates it. She doesn't like it. She's like, God damn it. Don't do it, you stupid man. I feel like that's with every kind of flirtation he throws at her. She hates it, but she likes it at the same time.
Yeah, I think maybe he likes the attention. I don't know. In and around this scene, there's this whole thing where Hemingway, Gellhorn, and a bunch of their journalist friends, when they were writing what was happening in Spain, they would tend to kind of gloss over any negative things that the Republicans were doing because they were obviously on their side. They obviously perceived the fascists as the bad guys, and so that's what they wanted to cover. And so someone sort of brings this up with Martha and is like, oh, like, you know, you're not really sort of fairly covering this conflict. And she says, fuck all your objectivity shit. And the real Martha Gellhorn loved, the phrase, your objectivity shit. So this is definitely based on real life.
Yeah, it made me laugh a bit. It's a difficult movie in the sense that it's kind of funny, but it's also very serious at the same time. So I never know if I'm allowed to laugh at what's going on. But anyway, speaking of serious, Gellhorn Martha rescues a child from a shelling, running out into the street dangerously as they're being shelled. So she's risking her own life, and she's been struggling to write. And I guess her experiences of seeing the common man in the war inspire her to write. So when she gets back to the hotel after rescuing the child, she finally sits down to write. But that's when a shelling hits the hotel, and she and Hemingway smash in a very visceral scene that I didn't necessarily want to see.
It was so, like, the building is shaking and there's plaster falling down onto the bed with them. I thought it was a bit much, but I mean, maybe that's because I'd already read past this part in the biography where pretty much what happened in real life, from Martha's point of view anyway, is that she realized that it was dangerous to be in Spain in this era if you didn't, quote unquote, belong to someone. If there was this perception that you belonged to a man, then other men would leave you alone. So she kind of was like, well, I like this guy Hemingway well enough, might as well smash him for this purpose.
I think that's also what Hemingway tells her when he locks her in the first time, right? Like, if I leave the door open and you're this blonde bombshell in this town full of Spaniards, you're going to be in trouble. So that's what he says.
Well, a lot of men have come to fight, right? And there's just not that many women around.
Yeah, the smashing, the plaster is meant to be this sensual. It's like filmed in a really strangely sensual way. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, they're being bombed. Maybe not make this a fancy love scene right now.
Yeah, I could have taken it or left it,
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So behind the scenes, Paco has supposedly been arrested by local Republican forces and shot as an alleged fascist spy. Now, the character of Paco, his name has been changed, and I can only suspect that it's because what happened with him is a little murky. His real name was Jose Robles, and we think now that instead of being killed by local Republican forces, he may have been killed by Soviet agents. He worked as an interpreter for the local head of Soviet intelligence, and they weren't very forgiving, if information was getting out and that kind of stuff. After the Spanish Civil War, Stalin ended up purging a lot of the Russians that had gone to Spain because he was not very happy with how the war ended. But yeah, so Paco's gone anyway. He's vanished. And Koltsov, he's our main Russian guy, he accuses Dos Passos of being a spy because Dos Passos is very close to Paco. And this causes a rift between Dos Passos and Hemingway. And we get a voiceover from Martha saying that Koltsov was arrested 2 years later in Russia and sentenced to death.
Yeah, I really like the brief appearance of this character of Paco. He's like a guy on a horse, and he's very heroic, and we see him like shoot his guns in a very cool way. He's like the symbol, really, in the movie. And I guess maybe he was a little bit in real life, I can't tell. But we also see him, quote unquote, disappear. We see him reluctantly get into some Russian's car, and then we never see him again. And Dos Passos is really sad about it, and he's worried about him, and he's the only one who's asking about him, and that's what makes him suspicious, I guess.
Yeah. And there's also this sort of thing that's happening, sort of in line with what I was saying about Hemingway and some of the others presenting the war in a way that perhaps glossed over some of the negative things that the Republicans were doing. Hemingway and others were sort of lending their celebrity to Soviet propaganda, and they were kind of helping to cover up, for example, possible Soviet responsibility for Robles's death. And so Dos Passos was not keen on any of that. Him and Hemingway really had a falling out over it.
So Hemingway collaborates with Yorgos Evans, the documentary maker, to produce their documentary, The Spanish Earth, which is the movie that was partially made at the party at his house earlier in the film. So he takes over the job of writing and reading the narration because they've got Paco out of the film entirely, and the beef with Dos Passos becomes very permanent. And Martha again tells us in voiceover that Dos Passos' politics eventually shifted very far to the right. So he leaves.
Yeah, being up close and personal with Soviet repression in Spain really turned him away from left-wing politics. He later actually campaigned for Richard Nixon.
Hemingway says something to Dos Passos that made me go, ooh, that hurt, because he says, being a coward doesn't stop you from writing a book, or something like that. And then earlier in the film, they said something about there being a need for more books or something. So it's like this quip. He's just flat out calling him a coward because when they were being under attack earlier in the movie, Dos Passos had not wanted to join them at the front for shooting the documentary, so it was not a very good look for Dos Passos, I guess, but I also kind of felt for him.
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely getting sort of a inside bar from the main relationship between Gellhorn and Hemingway. We're also getting a little bit of the mid-century American intelligentsia drama, if you will.
Yeah.
And in this scene, it's interesting because you see Gellhorn doing sound effects. Like she's sort of mimicking these different sounds that, you know, like when they're making the movie, they need a sound like a shelling. So she's got to make these sound effects. And apparently real life Martha did do the sound effects for that movie, or some of them anyway.
Neat. I mean, it is kind of neat. Had you really hate Hemingway? I think he's not a very nice man.
Well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but he had some problems.
You don't say.
Yeah, so Hemingway begins work on his Spanish Civil War novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's the one that I read. It's quite substantially based on his experiences. Like, you can tell that he was there, and a lot of the real stuff that he experienced got incorporated into the novel. At this point, obviously, he's hanging out with Martha quite a lot. He asks Pauline for a divorce, and she reacts very badly. I was like, girl, because Hemingway actually left his first wife for Pauline, who is also a writer. So I'm like, girl, if he'll leave someone for you, he will leave you. And then when he left Pauline, he actually married Martha 3 weeks later. So ostensibly his marriage to Pauline ended in like 1939, but realistically, he was with Martha for quite a while before that.
Probably in Spain. I mean...
Oh, definitely in Spain. They were together, I think they met in 1936, and they took up with each other pretty shortly after that.
I do wonder, though, this character of Pauline, they make her seem rather kind of unwilling to know what she knows, because I'm sure she knows. But she seems, in the movie, she seems really convinced that Hemingway's in love with her. I'm like, really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they have kids together and stuff, right? And like, I think Hemingway liked the idea of a domestic life more than he liked the actual domestic life. So when he was around, we do get some scenes where he's being good with his kids, etc. But he wasn't very good at actually being the husband and dad who was around.
Yeah. The scene where Hemingway tells Martha that he's filed for divorce and gotten the divorce, she doesn't like it. She's like, why'd you go and do that? Like, it doesn't seem to me that she wanted to get married very much.
In real life, she had quite a long relationship with this French guy because she had lived in Paris for a little while. And her parents really did not approve of it because he was married. She took up with a lot of guys who were already married. And I think part of her agreeing to marry Hemingway was that she didn't want to be in this situation with her parents again, where she was like very publicly with this guy who was married to someone else. I don't know that getting married was ever her like ultimate goal in life by any means.
Maybe just again the means to an end, rather. Like also in the war, belonging to someone was almost a means to an end. But yeah, what I thought was funny, again, because Lars Ulrich is in this, is that Metallica has a song called For Whom the Bell Tolls, based on the Hemingway book. So I like these kind of coincidences.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the line originally comes from a poem, I believe.
What did you think of the book? Is it a good book?
Hemingway has a distinctive writing style, and like some people are a really big fan. I totally get why he was such a famous, eminent writer in the mid 20th century. I think that he's a little heavy on and I mean, he was known for this, right? This like really like hyper masculine sense of everything. I don't think that he writes like amazing female characters by any means. So I liked it. And I do have another Hemingway book on my list because I do want to read A Farewell to Arms. But yeah, I don't know that I would say he's my favorite writer, but just because his style is not for me, really, just not because he's like a bad writer or anything.
So I don't think I'll read it, but I'll take your word for it. Hemingway and Gellhorn acquire a home in Cuba. Think of it, yeah. This will become their base for the remainder of their marriage. And it's kind of a rundown house, and it's filled with stray cats. And it looks fun. Like, it looks like a fun summer house, but not one that you'd live in permanently. Maybe visit for a day and then leave. They watch Franco's victory in the news. And that's in April 1939, so that's where we're at. And while they're in their home, Hemingway dedicates his new novel to her, which she really likes.
Yeah. Gellhorn had long been vocal about Spain being the canary in the coal mine, as it were, for the spread of fascism. She was adamant that it was a dress rehearsal for another great war. And of course, she was not the only person to say this, but I always think it's interesting to hear about what people thought on the cusp of World War II. People sort of had a sense of what was coming. And yeah, Hemingway actually continued to live part-time at Fincha throughout his marriage to his fourth and final wife. And he actually would continue to go there seasonally until the property was expropriated by the Cuban government in 1960, when the communists were in power, and is now actually a museum and you can visit.
Is it a museum about him?
It is, yeah.
Oh, cool.
Gellhorn goes to Finland to cover the Winter War. She and Hemingway exchange letters while she's gone. For these two, distance really makes their heart grow fonder. When they're apart from each other, they forget that they're having knockdown, drag-out fights all the time. There's this real Hemingway quote that you hear in the movie where he says, "I am stinko deadly lonely," if you can imagine author Ernest Hemingway saying those words.
I did like seeing some of the Winter War, even though it looks bloody ridiculous to see soldiers on skis. I cannot get used to that imagery. The divorce from Pauline comes through. Martha is reluctant to marry, but she lets Ernest talk her into it. And then they're off to China to cover Japanese bombing, which is the second Sino-Japanese war. And Martha is on an assignment for Collier's magazine, and Ernest is just following along. So this is in her book. She calls him the unwilling companion. And the way she describes this in her book, in her travel book, she's quite funny. I quite like her writing. But she also seems to take issue with just about everything that's going on around her. So she hates the way people snore, and the way people talk, and the way she has to go to an outhouse to do her business, and all that sort of thing. And Hemingway just finds it hilariously funny. He's like, "You wanted to go to China. Look who's in China now." So Hemingway hangs out at the hotel and he's kind of hanging out with the elite. And Martha's up in the thick of it, up to her elbows in the muck, basically, being guided around by government representative Mr. Ma, played by Keone Young. And this character is also in the book, and he's exactly like he is in the movie. So they captured him really well, including his famous saying, whatchamacallit. He says it like 20 times in the book.
Yeah, so the Second Sino-Japanese War sort of led up to and included World War II. I think there's this sense of perhaps separation for us, but I think if you lived in China, it all kind of blended together. It's funny that you say that about Martha, because that was one of the things I didn't like about her, reading about her in the biography, was that she would get to a place and she would immediately be like, I'm bored. I hate this. This person is intolerable. I don't want to deal with this, blah, blah, blah. Like the second that she got somewhere, she was finding all the reasons why she should leave. And like that, to me, it was just frustrating. It was just like, someone who's just constantly has negative thoughts about everything, and they just, instead of actually like addressing those negative thoughts, they're just like, well, I'm just going to leave. I'm going to go somewhere else. And then the process just repeats itself.
That's really interesting, because I think in the book, because she wrote it afterwards, she's very aware of it and she kind of makes fun of herself. So I guess she's got some like retrospective awareness to her, where she's like, oh, I was being kind of a annoying little shit about this. What I thought was interesting, which is kind of a change from the movie, is that in the book she describes Hemingway and her going everywhere together. So when she goes off by herself in the movie, Hemingway's pretty much with her the entire time in the book that she writes. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think also maybe pertinent to later events is that after this trip, Hemingway ends up writing a few pieces about the trip, and his pieces get more traction than hers because he's quite a bit more famous. And she kind of doesn't really like that very much. And he's like, well, you made me come. I was there to protect you in China. While they're in China, they interview General Chiang Kai-shek, played by Larry Tse. And I think the nickname for him was Cash My Check, because he was sort of working quite substantially behind the scenes with the Americans. And they interview him and his wife, Madame Chiang, played by Joan Chen. So General Chiang led the Republic of China from 1928 until his death in 1975. Although, of course, if you know anything about 20th century Chinese history, he had to lead his government from exile because they were defeated by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. So he, quote unquote, led an exiled government in Taiwan until 1975. And they also had the opportunity to interview his, we'll call it, political opponent, Chu Enlai, played by Anthony Brandon Wong. And Chu Enlai was a prominent communist. He became the first premier of the People's Republic of China after the communist coup. So they're kind of getting the both sides of the situation here. More jealousies flare up between them. Also, in the biography, they sort of mention that both Hemingway and Gellhorn, when they wrote about these meetings, they kind of went a little soft on General Chiang and perhaps should not have done that. But yeah.
Interestingly enough, in the movie, Martha is kind of really honest with Madame Chiang. She offends her almost, and she has to kind of talk her way out of that. And she doesn't really make any friends in that conversation, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm not sure it went that way in real life. Perhaps that's the way Martha would have liked it to have gone.
Maybe. Sounds like something she wished she would have done, like being that honest about. Is it about the jade brooch being made by children's hands or something in the movie? I already forgot, but something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this guy was the extremely corrupt authoritarian leader of China, so he was doing a bunch of not great shit, and they did not really call him out on that in any way.
No. Martha is trying to get a war assignment in Europe in 1943, while Hemingway plays war, quote unquote, and they argue when Hemingway then poaches her position at Collier's, which is kind of a dick move.
Yeah, so kind of what really happened was that Martha was already in Europe. She had reported from Czechoslovakia before the war. When the war started, she was reporting from air bases in England. She was interviewing bomber crews and that kind of thing. She went to Italy, so she was reporting from Cassino. She was actually kind of up in the thick of it in combat. And she ended up reporting from Finland, Hong Kong, Burma, Singapore, like all kinds of places immediately before and during the war. And while she was overseas filing these reports, she was getting all these letters from Hemingway being like, well, if you were really my wife, you'd be here in my bed. And I miss you and you should be here with me. And that's your duty as a wife, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, well, why don't I give you a few of my articles for Collier so you have an excuse to come over here and join me? Which was very generous of her because she probably would have known that his name would take precedence over hers in the publication. And he was like, no, I don't want to. You come here. So she went home. She was there for a brief period. They fought like cats and dogs. And then that was when he decided that he was going to take the Collier's thing after all. And he was like, I have a seat on a plane. Women aren't allowed. See you later. So that's when he sort of fucked off overseas to start his war reporting on World War II. And she had to kind of find her own way over there.
What a crybaby. Holy fuck. Why didn't they make the movie about all the things she was doing in all the places she was? Like, if you look at the list of where she's been and what she's reported on, that would have been a great movie.
Yeah, they definitely made this movie about the relationship and less about her, I guess. I mean, it's her perspective of the relationship, but yeah. And there's a real quote from Hemingway that he apparently yelled at Martha, which was, they'll still be reading me long after you've been eaten by worms.
What a fun and supportive husband.
Yeah. So Gellhorn, so far, she's not having a lot of luck as a female war correspondent, and she decides that she wants to cover the D-Day landing. So she sort of blags her way onto a nursing ship, and she goes to Normandy. And Martha actually landed on the beach to help load wounded to take them back to the ship, which of course made Hemingway incredibly jealous because he obviously was not on the ground. She's widely believed to be the only female journalist to be present during the landings. And she actually lost her war correspondent accreditation over it. Like, she got arrested because of her stowaway shenanigans, but that did not really stop her from further war coverage. It just made it a little bit more difficult at times. And meanwhile, Hemingway meets the woman who will be his fourth wife, Mary Welsh, played by Parker Posey, who I simply cannot look at without thinking of White Lotus these days. And Gellhorn catches them being cozy when she comes to visit Hemingway after he's been injured in a car accident. And it's kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, and she becomes the only one of his wives to ask for a divorce.
I absolutely hate that scene where he's in the hospital bed and Mary Welsh is like draped over him. And he's like, oh, it's whatever he calls it. What's the nickname again?
He called her Marty.
It's the Marty. It's the Marty. And he's such a, like, come on, dude, it's your wife. But yeah, he's just a dick.
Yeah. They spoke about some details of the divorce toward the end of the war in London. And after that, they never saw each other again. And Gellhorn didn't really speak of him publicly, but they were together for 8 years and married for 4. And definitely the relationship had a long-lasting impact on the rest of her life.
I wonder if that's why she called him the unwilling companion in her book. And also, I guess because she didn't want her work to be overshadowed by him the entire time. Which makes sense.
Yes. Hemingway was not quite as mum on his side of things.
I don't think he was mum about anything in general.
Yeah.
He was just loud. Anyway, Martha covers, it goes pretty quickly from here, by the way. Martha covers Dachau and Auschwitz concentration camps. And in the movie, they show you real footage from Dachau, which I think I would have preferred maybe if they didn't show, because it's such an abrupt scene. They almost don't give it enough time for it to be respectful. Like, it's very quick, but it's very jarring. In a sense, it's also very quick and very jarring to her. She talks about how it made her feel. But I don't think I like it very much. I think it either needed more time to breathe or just not have been those shots.
Yeah, I think it could have been like an end card even, just because, you know, this movie needs to decide what it wants. Either it's a movie about their relationship or it's a movie about her. Yeah. In the novel I read, Point of No Return, the main character is a Jewish soldier, and Martha Gellhorn was Jewish, or she was partly Jewish. I think both of her parents were like half Jewish. And so they were never a particularly religious family, but she had an awareness of this part of her identity. So in the novel, she's written this character who is a Jewish soldier. He works as a Jeep driver for an officer, and he witnesses Dachau at the end of the war. And in a fit of rage, driving his Jeep, he mows down a group of Germans and kills some of them. And this is kind of an articulation of how Dachau made her feel. It made her so angry. And she actually wrote, "A darkness entered my spirit. There in that place, in the sunny early days of May 1945, I stopped being young. I do not really hope now. Not really. I only feel one can never give up."
Yeah, I think we get a similar line from her in the movie after we see those images too, about how Dachau broke her. Sure it did. Like, it's one of the most awful things you can imagine. I don't think anyone can go there and be unaffected by that.
Yeah, so we cut to many years later. Hemingway, depressed, undergoes shock treatment. He's living an unhappy existence with Mary, his fourth wife, and we see him die by suicide, July 2nd, 1961.
Yeah, kind of sad. I mean, he's a dick, but I'm still kind of sad. I did like how they made him age in the movie. They did a great job of making him look like sick and haggard and tired of life. But was Mary there for his suicide? Because it's implied that she's in the other room as he shoots himself.
Yeah, I think she was. And she told everyone that he died in an accident cleaning his gun. But Hemingway suffered many serious health problems during his life. He had a genetic condition called hemochromatosis, which meant he was in a lot of pain a lot of the time. His mental state was deteriorating towards the end of his life. He had severe injuries from 2 plane crashes, and he had 6 untreated concussions. And he battled alcoholism and depression. All of this was made worse by, those other injuries that he had. And the suicide attempt that finally worked was not his first attempt. And so he had previously been taken to a hospital. His friends took him home so he could get some of his clothes. And when he came into the house, he made a beeline for the gun cabinet and chambered around. But one of his friends tackled him and was able to take the gun out of his hands. And on the way to the hospital, they took him by plane. He tried to walk into the propeller. And when they got him on the plane, he tried to jump out of the plane. So this was a guy who was just profoundly having a difficult time. He was suffering a lot. And so I don't think it was a gun accident. I think he killed himself.
Jesus, that's rough. We see the end of the interview with older Martha, who says you won't be a footnote in someone else's life, which is funny. If there's a movie which is called Hemingway and Gellhorn instead of Gellhorn and Hemingway, but I don't think she would have liked this movie particularly much. She reminisces about the old days once alone and then puts that away to go on another assignment. And I like how she just decides at the end that the interview's done. She's like, "Oh no, we're done. You can go. You can leave." It's like, no, it's on my terms or it's not at all.
Yeah, for sure. Very much like how she lived.
Yeah. Oh, and that's the end of it.
Yes. Martha went on to cover the human face of further conflicts, including Vietnam. She covered a few civil wars in South America. She was all over the place. She published a total of 15 books, including novels, collections of short stories, and I think 3 nonfiction works. She got married and divorced once more. Through her relationship with her second husband, she had a few stepchildren. One of them she got along with particularly well. She adopted a son of her own, whom she did not get along with particularly well. She lived all over the world throughout her life. She would literally go places and she would set up a home for herself. So she lived in Mexico, she lived in Kenya, she was all over. And she ultimately, just suffering a slow decline in health and blindness that made it impossible to travel, read, or write, which were kind of the 3 central tenets of her life. She also died by suicide on February 14th, 1998. She was 89 years old.
Imagine being that old and then committing suicide because you're like, it's been enough.
Yeah, she was pretty much blind. Like, she couldn't read or write without help. She was also hard of hearing. She was just having a hard time doing all the stuff that was interesting to her. And I think she's a little vain. She had all these young friends, and I think there was this sense that they were, out and about living these interesting lives. And she finally was starting to really show her age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sad.
Yeah. Oof. There's a few things that crop up towards the end of the biography that really made me be like, what? So she adopts this kid, and I think she has this sense that this is what's going to make her happy. This is going to be the long-term relationship that actually works, because throughout her whole life, the only relationship that really seemed based on unconditional love and respect was the one she had with her mother. So I think she thought adopting this kid from an Italian orphanage would fill the hole in some way. And she just was perhaps not naturally suited to being someone's mother. She was constantly on the kid's case about his weight. She sent him to boarding school, and every time he was home, it was constantly this battle of her trying to withhold food from him. And later on, towards the end of her life, she rewrote her will saying that he wouldn't inherit anything unless he lost some weight. And
No, Martha.
yeah, so I think she had a hard time with other people not living up to her expectations, but she also had a hard time with herself not living up to her expectations. Like, she would constantly write about how she regretted the way a lot of her relationships had turned out, or she regretted her own behavior in certain scenarios and that kind of stuff. But she doesn't seem to be able to help herself. She was hard on everyone, including herself.
She kind of, in that way, reminds me of Lee, who also seemed to be never quite content with whatever was going on and then moving on. Though I think Lee might have been slightly more successful in that sense than Martha. But also these very moving, always moving kind of personalities.
Oh yeah, she was very nomadic. She couldn't seem to settle anywhere. And I think she was always just moving on to move on. Maybe the next thing I find will be the thing that will make me happy. She was driving in Africa when she was living there, and she hit and killed a child. So
oh my God.
The kid ran out on the road. Like, it wasn't her fault. But also, I mean, that's got to do a number on your psyche, right?
Sure. Yeah. So we should rate this movie. How many cats in a Cuban house out of 10 would you rate this movie?
Y'all, they had so many cats in that house. Like, I'm not kidding you. And they never got any of them fixed, so the problem just compounded itself. I don't know, man. I think I'm going to give this movie 5 cats in the house out of 10. It was too long. Not that I didn't appreciate the opportunity to learn more about the sort of 20th century intellectuals and what they were up to. But when I was reading the biography, I found it a bit slow going. And I think it's because I just didn't like Martha very much. I think, like I said at the beginning, Nicole Kidman did a great job. I don't think that I would necessarily recommend this movie. I think if you want to find out about Martha, you should definitely read the biography and give this one a miss. What about you?
I think you are right on point. I am also going to give this movie 5 cats in a Cuban house. I already forgot my own rating system. That's great. 5 cats in a Cuban house out of 10. Because I also thought the pacing was kind of off, and the way they distributed the different periods in the film were kind of off, and I didn't particularly like the relationship part of it either. So what is there to like? It's not necessarily bad acting or anything. Acting's fine. But I don't know, it's just not you don't want to root for either of these people. Or for mostly any of the people in the movie. I feel like you need something to be happy about in this movie, and there really isn't very much of it. So I also thought it was too long. I was like, when's this movie gonna end? And when is it going to get to World War II? Was also another thought I had when I was watching it. So yeah, don't recommend for the storytelling. Acting's fine, but don't watch it, I don't think. Unfortunately, I really wanted to like it, but now can't really say that I do. Are you reading anything new since we last recorded?
I'm taking a crack at SAS Duty Before Glory by Tony Rushmer, which is the book about reg seekings, and that will become relevant soon.
Excellent. I'm also still reading that book, so nothing new from me, so I'm gonna close down this episode for us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. You can follow us and find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com. And if you want to send this episode to a friend, despite the fact that the movie's not very interesting, I think this episode's quite nice. So do send it to a friend. And don't forget to rate us, because we love you if you do. See you next week.
Bye.